on Mill Creek. Essentially what that means is we have monitoring systems to keep track of how much water is there and who is receiving that water. That helps us follow the court decrees that have been set forth. The other thing that's going on in the Moab Spanish Valley area is that we are restricted to small or temporary applications when it comes to new water rights. And that primarily has to do with our last point that I have here, which is that the Moab Spanish Valley is subject to all Colorado River compacts and treaties. And those compacts and treaties affect a lot of what we do as a division in the 05 area. So I want to help you understand a little bit more what that means. So Utah is entitled to 23% of the upper basin allocation on the Colorado River. That upper basin states make up of Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And of all the water given to them, Utah has claim to 23% of that. Now currently, there's a little less than 23% being used. However, there are many approved water rights that have yet to be developed. Or meaning there's a lot of paper water, but not necessarily a lot of water that's being physically used on the ground. Now, in order to protect Utah's interest in this 23% and to protect people who have approved water rights, in 1990, the state engineer came forth with the Colorado River Policy, which is what we follow currently in the Moab Spanish Valley area. So I want to help you get a better understanding of what that policy is. Next slide, there we go. So currently, if you're in the Moab Spanish Valley area, we will let you file for a new application to appropriate water. So this is getting to another part of what I want to talk to you tonight about, and that is applications. So we're going to discuss new applications to appropriate water, change applications, and temporary and fixed time. So the first one here are the new applications to appropriate. So if you wanted to, you could file for a new application to appropriate in the Moab Spanish Valley, and we would follow the 1990 Colorado River Policy, which is we would allow you to apply up to for 1 acre of irrigation, 10 head of livestock, and 1 full-time domestic residence. In the Moab Spanish Valley, that would essentially equate to 6.73 acre-feet of water. That is a volume amount. Now, what I'm trying to demonstrate to you on this picture on the right is to help you understand another thing that the division does. Based on research done by Utah State University, the division has broken up the state into regions, and those regions on this instance have to do with what we call duty values. So essentially what that means is how much water would a person need to grow 1 acre of alfalfa for a growing season? And that's heavily dependent on elevation. So what you can see here again is that Moab is in the center of this photo, and that the Moab Spanish Valley is in yellow. That yellow area is they need 6 acre-feet of water for 1 acre of irrigation. If you were in the purple area, it would be 5, and if you were in the green area, it would be 4. So for the Moab Spanish Valley, your primary allocation in this 6.73 acre-feet of water would be for irrigation. Irrigation uses the most amount of water. And the 0.73 acre-feet would cover your livestock and your domestic residents. So as the policy currently sits, we do allow for new applications up to this amount of water in the Moab Spanish Valley. Go ahead, next slide. But now I want to help you understand a different type of application. We call those change applications. So change applications have to do with water rights that are currently in existence already, all right? And what we will allow you to do with a change application is either change your nature of use, your point of diversion, or your place of use. So let me give you a few examples. If you wanted to change your nature of use, let's say you have one of these applications for 1 acre of irrigation, 10 head of livestock, and 1 domestic house. Let's say you don't want the horses anymore, and you would like to convert that into more irrigation water. We would allow you to do that, and we would help you go through the process of understanding of how much more irrigation you could put in if you got rid of your livestock use. And so that's a change of use. Now for point of diversion, think of this as simply as you're changing where you're diverting the water from. So maybe your well on your property has gone bad, and you're good buddies with your neighbor, and he's gonna let you use his well now. So you're going to change, instead of saying, hey, I divert my water from this well on my property to my neighbor's well on his property. For surface water users, point of diversion is where you're diverting the water off of the creek or the river. So maybe you have one point of diversion, but you'd like to have a new one further upstream. We would allow you to change that. The other thing you can do is change your place of use. So for example, if you have a home in Moab City that has a water right currently, but you are now building a new home out in Spanish Valley, you could apply and try to move that water right from your home in your home in Moab out to your new home in Spanish Valley. This would be a change of where you're using the water. Okay, so you can file for these applications that allow you to change things within a water right that's already in existence. The other thing I want to help you understand about change applications is, as the policy currently sits for the Colorado River Drainage Basin and the state of Utah, we do allow trans-basin movement of water rights, or meaning you can move a water right anywhere within its drainage basin. Next slide. So now that we've talked about new applications and change applications, I want to talk about the last type of applications, which are fixed time and temporary applications. So let's say you're a person that's in a position that you need more water than the 6.73 acre feet, possibly because let's say you have 5 acres of land that you need to irrigate. Well, one of your options to get the water that you need to do that is you could file for a fixed time application, which in some fixed time and temporary applications, we will allow a water right to have more water than the 6.73 acre feet. But what protects us is that there is a time-dependent statute in that water right. I mean, the water right's only good for up to 20 years for fixed time, or 1 year for a temporary. After that time has elapsed, you can file for an extension, but the state engineer is going to review that and decide, is there water still available to allocate to fulfill the need of this water right? The answer to that could be yes or no. So fixed time applications, you can get more water than a new application, but you need to understand that every 20 years for fixed time or 1 year for temporary, you have to apply, and it will be reevaluated whether or not that could continue in perpetuity. So the last thing I want you to understand about fixed time and temporary applications that make them different from new applications and change applications is no proof is required. So some of you may be wondering what that means, and I think this is important that we go over this because I'm afraid many water users are unsure about this point. So if you have a new application or a change application that you've applied for and that water right gets approved, you then have up to 5 years to what we call prove up on it, or essentially put in the uses in the way that you said you would, and then submit to us paperwork saying that you have done that, and then give us the opportunity to come out and verify that those uses are in place. Once that is done, your water right goes from an approved status to a perfected status. Now that is a process that takes place for new applications to appropriate and change applications. However, for fixed time and temporary applications, there's no requirement to submit proof. And again, what protects us here is that there is a time dependency on these water rights where they will be reviewed if the person files for an extension. Okay, next slide. So, talking about all applications though, there are some other key points to understand. Every application is considered on its individual merits of what is to be done and how will it be beneficial. The other thing is that we as this division take a very serious look at, will approving this application interfere with any existing water rights? And if it does, that is a serious and weighty matter that we take very seriously. So we look at that. And then the other thing I want you to understand is that all applications, except for the 1 year temporary ones, are advertised in your local newspaper. We try to involve the public in what is going on in their area so that they're aware of these applications and these changes that are taking place. And that gives them an opportunity to comment and be knowledgeable about what is happening with the water in their area. So we've talked about 3 types of applications. That's new applications appropriate, change applications, and fixed time and temporary. Now we're going to move on to the next part. Go ahead, next slide. So now I want you to have a better understanding of restrictions that the division currently already has in place to protect the aquifer and the watershed in the Moab Spanish Valley area. So these are very specific restrictions to this area. One of them is we have restrictions within the Moab city limits. If you live within the Moab city limits, we do not allow for new applications for domestic use. So even if you have a home and you've drilled a well, one of the uses on your water well could not be for domestic residents, or you couldn't hook your house up to this well based on a new water right, okay? The other thing we do not allow for is depending on if you're east or west of Main Street. If you're east of Main Street, we only allow you to apply for up to a 1/4 acre of irrigation. If you're west of Main Street, you can apply up to 1 acre irrigation. Whether you're east or west, you can get up to 10 head of livestock. So within Moab city limits, we don't allow any new applications for domestic use, and then we limit your irrigation to either a 1/4 acre or 1 acre. Next slide. The other thing that is protected in the Moab Spanish Valley area is the upper Mill Creek watershed. This area highlighted in yellow on the map on the right is the area that is protected and is considered within this upper Mill Creek watershed. So within that watershed, we do not allow for any new surface or groundwater appropriations. The only way that a person could get the right to use water within this yellow region is they would have to purchase shares in the Moab Irrigation Company and then file a change application on those shares and move them to wherever it is they need to use within this yellow area. We've done that in order, again, to protect water users who already have water rights in this area for surface and groundwater. Next slide. So in summary, I've discussed a little bit about management, or the framework that we have to work within as a division. Particularly from that, I want you to take away that this area is subject to all the Colorado River compacts and treaties. And so from that, we have generated a 1990 policy from the state engineer that limits how much water we're able to allocate. Now, when it comes to applications, there are 3 types of applications: new applications to appropriate, change applications, and fixed time and temporary applications. No matter the application, it's going to be considered on its individual merits, and we highly take into consideration whether it's going to affect water users who already have water rights. And all applications except for 1-year temporaries are advertised in your local newspaper so that the public can be made aware and given a chance to comment. And last of all, there are already restrictions in place to protect the watershed and the aquifer in your area. Namely, there are restrictions within the Moab city limits and within the upper Mill Creek watershed. Next slide. I really appreciate you guys taking a few moments to listen to me. I hope what I told you was more informative than confusing. And at this time, we'll be happy to answer a few questions, if there are any. Okay.
Maybe Cash, what I'll just kind of maybe pipe in here real quick. We do have a sign-in sheet for those of you in the chat. If you could take a look at the link that we've posted in the chat. I know some of you have joined later. So if you could just fill that out, then we'll make sure that you get any information that's mailed out additionally. And thank you, Cash. I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah. Cash, may I ask a question, please?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Cash, my name is Mike Duncan. I'm on Moab City Council, and I've been active on the city's Water Advisory Board as well. I'm also on the board of Moab Irrigation Company, for what that's worth. Thank you so much for the presentation. That's great. It's always good to hear this stuff again. It strikes me, though, that, if I may say so, what you described doesn't really move us into what I think of as being a new era in terms of water in the valley. And that you didn't mention the safe yield law. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit. And so far as the restrictions in Moab City are concerned, it strikes me that it's kind of backwards what you guys permit. You can't do any domestic use, which is where the city is growing, but you can go back and doing agriculture, stock, and irrigation, which is something that would have been much more common 50, 60 years ago. So why turning on heavy duty users when we'd like to make more of a higher and better use, if you will, of the water?
One part of that I'll answer, and then the other part I'll probably defer a little bit. So as far as safe yield and a groundwater management plan, we have two more presenters that are going to talk here. So my boss, Mark Stilson, and then also Teresa Williamson, our state engineer. They're going to address a little bit more about as far as groundwater safe yield and also the statutes that are in place for that. And then as far as the policy within the Moab City limits, I would say that I haven't been here long enough to know why we have that policy in place. So I'd ask if Mark could comment on that.
Sure, you bet, Cash. Those policies have been in place probably for over a couple of decades now. And one of the reasons we're doing this, Mike, is to look at our current policies and see what adjustments we need to make. So we wanted Cash to just make sure everybody understood where we were at currently. And that's going to set the foundation for discussions of where we go from here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Excuse me, this is Dave Early. Can you hear me? I have a question or a point.
Go ahead,
Go
Dave.
ahead, Dave.
Well, first of all, with a fixed time permit, it doesn't get reviewed for 20 years. And I'd say that's completely inappropriate in the Moab Spanish Valley right now. Another observation is with a temporary permit, you don't even have to publicize that you're doing that. And I find that extremely disheartening to water right holders. And as the mayor of Castle Valley for 8 years, I find that extremely disheartening and something that I don't think is appropriate any longer. And finally, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a valley in southern Utah where interbasin transfers of water rights are appropriate. And all this stuff comes from 30 years ago in 1990, I guess. But anyway, I just think all three of those things are really deserve some serious review and are completely inappropriate anymore. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dave, for your comment. And I like what Mark said earlier, that is the point of this public meeting. And also Teresa mentioned that we're here tonight to hear from you guys and your concerns. And as Mark said, my main goal here was just to try to lay the current foundation as things stand. And then as we talk about the new findings, especially from the USGS report, we can have great discussions about maybe where things need to go.
Thank you much.
Right, and I agree with Cash. Dave, those are the type of comments we're looking for, and that's the type of input we're looking for as we move forward.
Great, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for me? Okay, if not, then I believe our next presenter is Mike Drake. And so I will turn it over to him and allow him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Cash. As Cash said, my name is Mike Drake. I'm the Assistant State Engineer over Adjudication. And I'm going to give you a lowdown on adjudication. As Cash indicated, we've got 2 pending subdivisions in the Moab Spanish Valley area. And so we'll talk about each one of those. Let's jump to the next slide, Mark. First, I want to talk about the what and why of general adjudications. What is it and why do we do them? I think this will start to help answer some of the questions that we've gotten already. And so we'll jump into it here. So what is general adjudication? Well, it's a legal process that brings all water rights onto the records of the state engineer. And so you might ask, why is that important? Well, water use in most areas of the state began long before statehood. Pioneers and miners made their way into different parts of the state and developed water, placed it to use, and were just going along their lives. And statehood occurred much later, and more importantly, water law came into place following that. And the very first water laws were implemented in 1903 for surface water, and in 1935 this was extended to underground water. Again, there was a lot of water use that was occurring prior to those dates. Any water that was placed prior to those dates, that was placed into use prior to those dates, is what we would call a pre-statutory water right. This brings us to one of the big whys of general adjudication is a general adjudication brings these pre-statutory water rights onto the records of the state engineer. Cash mentioned some of the decrees that we have in the area. And generally these decrees were covering surface water, and these were for water rights that were pre-statutory water rights. I'm not incredibly familiar with the Moab water rights, but that is very typical with many decrees in the area. And what the general adjudication does is it brings all of those various pre-statutory water rights onto the records. Additionally, another reason we do general adjudications is to review them for non-use, to remove or reduce rights that are wholly or partially forfeited due to non-use. In the state of Utah, if a water user ceases to use their water right for a period of 7 years, then the water right is subject to forfeiture. When we are going through the general adjudication, we review these water rights to make sure that they are in fact being used, or if they're only partially being used, we might reduce them. Another reason we do general adjudications is to bring greater clarity to the water rights in an area. Especially with older water rights, we find that like points of diversion and places of use are inaccurate. Sometimes the water uses, what we use the water rights for, is inaccurate. As we work our way through the adjudication, we get a better handle on what defines these water rights. Furthermore, we dig into how these water rights work together. Are there multiple water rights that provide for a given beneficial use? These are some of the details that we gather and determine as we work our way through the general adjudication. Finally, at the end of a general adjudication, there is a decree on all the water rights. And as we work our way through this process, and I'll talk about the process, we resolve and define all of these water rights, and we end up with a detailed accounting of the water rights and how they work with each other, what their priority dates are, and that is now a judicial decree that has standing between all the various water users. Real quickly, you might ask, what does this mean for the Moab area? Well, I think maybe you can see that the general adjudication gives us a good solid idea of all of the rights in the area, and gives us the information we need to be able to make some of the informed decisions that Cash and Mark have already talked about. So let's talk about it. This slide that you see now is the adjudication process. We're not going to go into great detail in this forum, but as Cash indicated, we have two subdivisions underway, the Moab North subdivision and the Moab South subdivision. The North subdivision was initiated in April of 2018, and the Moab South subdivision was initiated in April of 2019. So we've been moving through the process and are nearing the publishing of the proposed determination. Right now we're in the process of evaluating claims, all the various claims that have come in as part of the adjudication process. If you don't know, a proposed determination is a listing of all of the various water rights that we have gone out and field reviewed and have identified, and it's our recommendation to the court of what we think the water rights are. So in the coming months, you're going to see us publishing the PDs, the proposed determinations for these areas, and moving through the final steps of the adjudication process. Once the proposed determination is published, there will be a 90-day period to file an objection, there will be a public meeting. And finally, if someone objects to what we publish in the proposed determination, we'll then enter a phase where we work with the objector and work through the items that they object to, and ultimately we're looking to resolve the concerns. And once all of the objections have been resolved, the courts enter a final decree, the decree that we've talked about previously. So let's jump over to the next slide and look at a map of this area. And we've seen a little bit of this before. This one's a little bit more adjudication specific. There are two prior subdivisions that have reached the proposed determination status, the Castle Creek and the Taylor Flat areas. And as previously indicated, the Moab North and the Moab South are underway. The Moab North is in review. Most of the field work has been completed, and we are reviewing it. There's some of the stats about the Moab North that you can see. And the Moab South was initiated a little bit later and is at about 47% completion level. And we're going to be working through that over the coming months. And our expectation is the proposed determination should be ready to be published sometime in 2021. And you know, some of those timelines are dependent on what we find and what we run up against, but that's kind of what we're looking at right now. So with that, that's a general overview of the adjudication in this area. And the next slide, I think, is just a question slide, and I'll take any questions on the adjudication if there are any.
Mike, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you anticipate that you will publish the two PDs together, or are you going to hold the one until you have them both done and publish them at once? Or are you going to publish the one when you got it done and then move on to the next one?
Good point. I meant to mention that. Our plan is to publish them at the same time together. Thank you, Jeff.
So Mike, one easy question. If you go back to your previous slide, I'm just interested in terms of what this whole process has resulted in, what percentage of abandoned water rights we can reclaim for other uses. That's my fundamental question.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't know if I have that the comparison exactly. So in the Moab North, there were 120 rights that were listed in that list of unclaimed rights. So these were rights that we had records of that were unclaimed. I don't know what that amounts to. We could certainly get into that. And as we develop these ideas that Mark is going to talk about, that will definitely come into play. And as far as arriving at precise numbers, it's probably premature because we're still reviewing. We have a lot of work to do to get to the bottom of all of that.
Okie dokie, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, any other questions on adjudication?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
I live in the 505 Moab South area. And let me say first that Mark Stilson has been extremely helpful as we've worked through an often convoluted history of water rights to Pack Creek itself as it flows through that area. Right now, we're subject to a decree that goes back almost 130 years and is expressed in terms of percent of flow and days of the week. Now, I know that that will be replaced by a new decree once the circuit court approves the final adjudication, but I want to just double check, can we assume that volume and time, or percent of flow and time, will be replaced by a strict acre feet allowance on that water right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I understand your question. And we try as much as possible to maintain the existing arrangement of decrees. We understand that, you know, hey, in a lot of cases these things have been working for many, many years, and so when we try and answer that question, we're going to look at, hey, how is this being distributed right now? What's the best way of doing this, and what is typical for surface sources? Now, you know, Mark can correct me because he is more intimately involved in this, but we generally try and keep the flow rate limitations because that is how surface water is distributed. Mark, do you have more information on that specific area?
I do, yeah. The lower users in the valley on Pat Creek, as we go through the adjudication process, we're finding that a lot of those have been abandoned. So it will definitely shift our understanding of how water is being distributed on Pat Creek. And when we come down to the final end of the adjudication process, I suspect it will be more in line with what we do traditionally around the state rather than a time system as set up in the original decree. That's just my own opinion, and that's kind of where I'm assuming we'll end up. So
yeah, that will be something we'll definitely have to talk about, and as we work our way through. But it is going to be our intention to try and preserve the relationships between the various water users, and you know, we clearly don't want to have water rights enlarged. We don't want to diminish water rights. We want to make sure that every iota of the water right is preserved as far as the law is concerned, and so we're going to be, you know, seeking to come up with a system that keeps that in place. Okay. Any last questions? Okay. Mark, I think it's your turn.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate Cash and Mike laying the groundwork for what we're doing. The real heart of this meeting today is this part that I'm going to present, which is the review of the USGS study that was published last year. To get us to this point, we have to understand some of the background, some of the history, understand our current policy, understand why we've started the adjudication, and why we helped fund and put together this new USGS study of the area. We've been working on this since 2012, when we began to get stakeholders in the valley together, Moab City, Grand County, San Juan County, a number of nonprofits, and a couple of other state agencies to help put together a funding package to have USGS come and do a new study of the groundwater resource for Moab Spanish Valley. The last comprehensive study that was done in 1971. Bill Gardner did some work down at the Colorado River in the Matheson wetlands in 2004 that raised some questions about the 1971 study. So we felt we really did need a new comprehensive study, and I'm very grateful that we were able to get that accomplished. And I want to thank Moab City and Grand County, San Juan County, and all of the partners who helped put together the funding to make this happen. So we're going to talk about, again, give you some background and talk about groundwater management first, and some of the code that we live with as the Division of Water Rights regarding groundwater management. So we're going to start with the question, how much groundwater development has taken place, and how much additional groundwater development can be sustained by the aquifers underlying Moab Spanish Valley? Now, why is this important? Because the Utah Code states that the withdrawal of water from a groundwater basin shall be limited to the basin's safe yield. Additionally, before limiting withdrawals in a groundwater basin to safe yield, the state engineer shall determine the groundwater basin's safe yield. Well, that makes sense. And then adopt a groundwater management plan for the groundwater basin. Groundwater management plans are established in Section 73.515 of Utah Code, and they have as their primary objective to limit groundwater withdrawals to safe yield. These plans can also look at other factors, including protecting the physical integrity of the aquifer and protecting water quality. So safe yield is officially defined as the amount of groundwater that can be withdrawn from a groundwater basin over a period of time without exceeding the long-term recharge of the basin or unreasonably affecting the basin's physical and chemical integrity. So again, we're faced with two critical questions. What is the supply? How much groundwater is available for use without exceeding the safe yield? And what's the demand? How much water has been appropriated for use and how much water is currently in use? That's the main impetus for doing the general water rights adjudication, is to get at the demand side of things. How much water has been appropriated? We know that previously we have used estimates of over 20,000 acre feet has been appropriated on paper. And then we're going to get into what's currently in use as we progress through this presentation. But we know we're over appropriated on paper, at least, for the Moab Spanish Valley. So let's start with some background on geology, and most of this is going to be taken from a USGS special study that was done a few years ago. This is an aerial view of the watershed showing North Fork and Mill Creek and Pat Creek. The actual study area included a couple areas outside of the Mill Creek, Pat Creek drainage. This includes Grandstaff Canyon and a little bit of the Cane Springs Creek area. This is figure 18 from the report. It shows the dynamics between the recharge and discharge that's happening in the watershed. So we have recharge from precipitation and from losing streams. We have discharge from wells being pumped in the valley, from spring flow, from wetland evapotranspiration, and subsurface outflow to the Colorado River, as well as return flow to the streams at the lower end of the system. Our interest as a division, as we've talked about appropriation policy in the valley, we're really focused on the two aquifers under the valley floor. This is the valley fill aquifer, which consists primarily of sand and gravel, and the Glen Canyon Group aquifer, which is the sandstone bedrock of the Navajo, Kanta, and Wingate formations. So the report looks at both the discharge and recharge estimates for the system. The Glen Canyon Group aquifer is the primary aquifer for the municipality. So Moab City and Groundwater and now San Juan County are all pulling on the Glen Canyon Group aquifer. It's a nice sandstone formation. You can actually see it on either side of the valley. And then as we look at a cross-section of the valley, this is cross-section EE down at the county line. You can see the Glen Canyon Group aquifer highlighted in gray. It is shown on either side of the valley. So if you look at the cliffs on the southwest side of the valley, and Johnson's up on top, you're seeing the Glen Canyon Group aquifer. It dips below the valley as part of the old salt dome collapse. And then you can see this valley fill aquifer highlighted in yellow sitting on top of it. To add even more complexity to the geology of the valley, we just looked at cross-section EE. Now we're going to look down the center line of the valley, so profile line JJ. Again, our Glen Canyon Group aquifer highlighted in gray. It's a nice thick aquifer formation. As we move down the valley, we get past our cross-section EE, and it begins to thin and then entirely disappears at this point in the valley, which is about where Mill Creek Drive comes into back onto Highway 191. This is a close-up of that area, and the red hatched area is paradox formation. So the Glen Canyon Group aquifer disappears and is not found under Moab proper. And this plays an important role, we'll see as we get towards the end of our presentation. So now let's dive into the USGS report proper. The objectives of the study were to better understand the sources of recharge to, the groundwater flow directions within, and the discharge points for both the Valleyfield and Glen Canyon Group aquifer systems. We also wanted to quantify the groundwater budget components of both the Valleyfield and Glen Canyon aquifer, including both recharge and discharge. The key findings of the report were that the Glen Canyon Group aquifer and the Valleyfield aquifer have distinct geochemical characteristics of very different waters. The Glen Canyon Group aquifer water being a very clean, pure water. Valleyfield aquifer has a heavier salt loading, higher TDS. The report found that there's limited connectivity between the two aquifers, although there is some mixing that's going on. Another important finding was that recharge, so the Glen Canyon Group aquifer occurs primarily at high altitudes, high elevation in the La Salles. And then finally, recharge to the Valleyfield aquifer occurs primarily from losing reaches of Pat Creek. So these findings, which are the key findings of the report, have changed the understanding of what's happening in the valley and where the primary source of recharge is taking place in the valley. The 71 study generally concluded that most of the recharge was taking place from the Glen Canyon Group aquifer. This new study completed by the USGS last year turns that around and says most of the recharge happening in the Valleyfield aquifer is occurring from Pat Creek, with some limited recharge coming in the valley from the Glen Canyon Group aquifer. This is a figure from one of the USGS presentations that highlights the difference between the two waters. You can see the Glen Canyon Group aquifer water circled in blue. This is a stiff diagram showing the salt loading of the two different waters. The Glen Canyon Group aquifer water is very clean and nice, and that's why the municipalities use it. It doesn't take a whole lot of treatment to use water from that aquifer. Pat Creek water has a very distinct distended signature showing a higher salt loading. You can see it here in the upper drainage of Pat Creek, and then the Valleyfield aquifer as it moves down the valley more closely resembles the Pat Creek water. We're going to start talking about volume of water now as found in the report, and we use the measurement of an acre foot of water. An acre foot is 325,851 gallons. It would cover an acre of ground 1 foot deep. If you've been out to Ken's Lake and you've seen the lake in the springtime when it's full, for perspective, Ken's Lake holds about 3,000 acre feet. We're going to start with the recharge end of things. Again, recharge happens in many different ways: direct precipitation, stormwater detention basins, which probably isn't a big part of it right now, but could be an important part of the recharge component going forward as development continues in the valley. Irrigation return flows, leakage out of Ken's Lake provides some recharge. Losing sections of Mill Creek, and then Pat Creek. On most normal years, Pat Creek disappears entirely into the Valleyfield aquifer by the time it reaches the midpoint of the valley. And then, of course, we have recharge taking place up on the La Salles, which contribute to both shallow and deep underground bedrock recharge. Look at the front end of the equation. The USGS performed a basin characterization model, which is a regional scale water balance methodology developed specifically for the Colorado River Basin that estimates direct infiltration of precipitation and runoff. So the estimates from this model run between 9,550 and 30,000 acre feet. Because it's just a model, it's not based on direct measurements. It's based on precipitation and the hydrogeologic characteristics of the basin. There's a high uncertainty and a wide range of estimate probable estimate recharge. A better way to do things is to look at the bottom end of the system, because we can measure things much more accurately as we look at the water discharging from the end of the system. We can measure the well and spring withdrawals. We can estimate the evapotranspiration from the vegetation. We can look at the return flows to the streams, and then we can come up with an estimate of the shallow underground flow. One of the key findings of the report, too, is that there's no deep underground flow exiting the valley, and we'll show that in a little bit more detail as we go along. For our division, what we're most interested in is what's beneath our feet in the Moab Spanish Valley. There's quite a bit of water coming into the system from the upper watershed, but we're primarily interested, as far as appropriation policy goes, what's in the aquifers underneath the valley floor. So we're going to look at the end of the system now, looking at discharge to streams, springs, wells, and then subsurface outflow to the Colorado River. By looking at the discharge side of things, the estimated total discharge from the system for the total study area was 14 to 16,000 acre feet. We're going to dial down now and look in more detail. There are couple of important caveats we need to talk about. Measurements for the study were done in the fall and represent a minimum estimate of groundwater discharge to streams and lower valley springs. And importantly, the Colorado River, which is the terminal discharge point for groundwater leaving the valley, it's difficult to quantify exactly how much groundwater is discharging subsurface to the river. And then finally, not all of the water has been accounted for because withdrawals from private wells for irrigation and domestic are not currently metered in the valley, and thus not accounted for in the study. If we look at streams, if we look at the upper watershed, this would be above the valley floor, above the Kens Lake diversion, above Powerhouse Dam. The amount of water that the study found is coming from groundwater sources, recharging back into or returning back into the streams in the upper watershed is between 6,300 and 8,800 acre feet. If we look at the valley proper, water returning to the lower end of Pack Creek and the lower end of Mill Creek from the Valley Fill Aquifer and from the Glen Canyon Group Aquifer was found to be between 1,000 and 2,500 acre feet. So that's the number we're really interested in. Most of the water coming off the upper watershed by the time it hits the valley floor is surface water that's being diverted into Kens Lake or being diverted into Moab Irrigation Company pipelines for use as irrigation water or outside watering. So what we're interested in as far as appropriation policy within the valley proper is this lower number of what's returning to the end of the system, the lower end of Pack Creek and the lower end of Mill Creek. And that number is fairly small at between 1,000 and 2,500 acre feet. We're gonna touch on that again as we get to the summary. To show you how this was done, this is figure 23 from the report, and it shows the measurement locations that USGS used in the study. I'm going to blow this up a little bit, and you can see right here on Pack Creek in the midpoint of the valley, this is a 2014 measurement, there was zero flow, but as we progress down the valley, Pack Creek begins to pick up flow, 1.4, 1.6, and by the time we hit the confluence with Mill Creek, Pack Creek's flowing 1.8 cubic feet per second. So all of that water is returning to Pack Creek from groundwater sources, primarily the Valley Fill Aquifer in the lower part of the valley. Then from the confluence of Mill Creek down to the confluence with the Colorado River, there's an additional pickup of about 1 CFS. So just right around 3 CFS of pickup during the fall of 2014 when the USGS did these measurements, coming back into the streams as return flow from groundwater sources. Next, we're going to look at Lower Valley Springs. These are the springs located along 191, Matrimonial, Water Park Springs, Watercrest Springs. The estimate on outflow from those springs ranged for the study period between 600 and 900 acre feet. Most of this water is in use. Watercrest Spring has numerous water rights on them for use, both with some commercial properties along 191 and for use in the Matheson wetlands. Let's turn our attention now to the municipal well and spring use. Most of this is happening in the middle part of the valley, centered around the Moab golf course. We can see a huge influx of Glen Canyon Group aquifer water in this area. You can see all of the springs that dot that area. And the big municipal suppliers, Moab City and Groundwater, are supplying their citizens from water from several important spring complexes and several important wells, municipal wells, here in the middle part of the valley. Estimates during the study time period ran from Moab City, a low of 1,600 acre feet to a high of 2,300 acre feet, and Groundwater between 1,000 and 1,100 acre feet, for a total of between 2,600 and 3,400 acre feet. Again, this was during the study time period that USGS looked at municipal use. The last piece of the puzzle is surface outflow to the Colorado River. Now, this is not a direct measurement. There's no way to measure the water that's moving underground through the river. So the USGS employed a geophysical survey and used electrical conductivity to get an estimate of where the fresh water was moving out of the valley. Originally, the 1971 study estimated that water was moving out along the whole contact with the Colorado River. The USGS 2019 study found that most of the fresh water is only being found and moving to the river in the southern part of the wetlands. Up here in the northern part of the wetlands, this was found to be a saltwater brine, a heavy brine. So not much movement of fresh water in the north part, primarily centered around where Mill Creek comes into the Colorado River and the south part of the wetlands. This is the biggest difference between the original the previous 1971 study done by Sumption and the 2019 study completed by USGS. The 1971 study estimated that the outflow to the Colorado River was 8,000 acre feet. That was the biggest chunk of water. In their recharge estimate at that time is the amount of water moving out of the valley to the Colorado River subsurface. Using a couple of different techniques, the USGS got at an estimate of between 300 and 1,000 acre feet. So you can see, again, down in this part of the valley fill aquifer is sitting up on top of the Paradox Formation, still salt dome formation, and contact with that formation has caused a significant layer of brine or heavy salt water to be formed, and the fresh water, as it moves down the valley, has to move up over that brine and make it to the Colorado River. So this is the big takeaway from the study, is that the previous 1971 estimate is far above what the current estimate is in terms of volume of water moving to the Colorado River. So let's look at a summary. Again, the total study area, 14 to 16,000 acre feet. If we dial that in, if you look at this column, it's the total watershed drainage area. This column, we're going to exclude the upper watershed. And we're going to look at the minimum as reported in this study. So the upper watershed could have as little as 6,300 coming into it, with gains in the lower Pack Creek and Mill Creek of 1,000 acre feet. Lower Valley Spring, 600 acre feet, subsurface outflow to the Colorado River could be as low as 300 acre-feet per year. Municipal and spring withdrawals, 2,600. And then there's an unknown amount of water for private well and spring withdrawals. So that would end up with a total of 10,800 plus whatever is in use by private wells and springs. If we exclude the upper watershed, again, recognizing that most, if not all of this water is being diverted as surface water on senior surface rights, what we're left with is 1,000 acre-feet, 600 from Lower Valley Springs, 300 subsurface, for a total of 4,500 plus the private well and spring use as a minimum amount of water found in the Valley Fill and Glen Canyon Group aquifers. So if you look at the two numbers highlighted in red, these are the only two volumes of water that's not in use. The Lower Valley Springs are in use, municipal well and springs are in use, the private well and springs are in use. So is there water still available moving out of the valley that's not in use? The answer to that, according to the USGS report, is yes, but not very much. On the minimum side, it could be as little as 1,300 acre-feet. If we look at the maximum side of things, we could be as high as 8,800 out of the upper watershed, as high as 2,500 out of the lower end of Pat Creek and Mill Creek, 900 out of Lower Valley Springs, 1,000 out of the subsurface flow to the Colorado River, 3,400 out of the municipal well and spring withdrawals, again, some private well and spring use. That gets us to 16,600, or a total, if we exclude the upper watershed, of 7,800 plus whatever is in use with the private well and spring withdrawals. So the takeaway for us as a division is that the USGS report shows that potentially there could be a lot of recharge coming into the basin, up to 30,000 acre-feet. But more realistically, for the total city area, there's probably between 14 and 16,000 acre-feet. And then if we dial it down to what's under the valley proper, in the Glen Canyon Group Aquifer and the Valley Fill Aquifer, that drops to between 4,500 and 7,800 acre-feet. All of that in use except for between 1,300 and 3,500 acre-feet. So that's a big takeaway. That was what we were after when we started down this road in 2012. That's what we wanted to know. Is there still water moving out of the valley that's not in use, and how much? And this study has helped us get to that answer. One last thing I want to touch on, and this doesn't have to do with the study itself, but it's an important component of what information that we need to know as we move forward with our decision making. It's one thing to have a theoretical estimate of what's happening in the watershed, but really we want to know what's really happening with the groundwater elevations and what's happening. And the only way to do that is with some groundwater monitoring. We did a series of presentations to the Moab Area Watershed Partnership. We piggybacked on their meetings and showed the current state of groundwater monitoring in the valley. Those presentations are found on our website under past meetings, and it provides a wealth of information about what's going on. I pulled one of those slides out to show, just to highlight. This graph shows the precipitation in the valley from 1970 to 2016. You can see the 1970s were a heavy period of drought, followed by an amazing amount of precipitation that came in the 80s. Since that time, the 90s and 2000s has been a mixed bag, some good years, some bad years. So what does that all translate to? There's a monitoring well next to Zach's Pizza Place in downtown Moab. And you can see the water level elevations are less than 10 feet below the ground surface, and that water table elevation is held pretty steady through the years with maybe a slight decline. As we move down to the middle of the valley, this is down by White Ranch where the big center pivots are in the valley. You can see in the 1970s, we were sitting at 22.5 feet, the water table elevation below ground. There was a significant decline in the 70s down to almost 50 feet, a huge rebound in the 80s, back up to almost within 12 feet of the surface, and then a steady decline since that time back to about 21.5 feet as measured in 2017. And then finally, for the south part of the valley, the upper part of the valley, there really is not a lot of information or monitoring that's going on down there. We don't have a good understanding or a good feel for what's going on in the south of the valley. So we would encourage continued improvement to our groundwater monitoring system. USGS is the primary agency monitoring groundwater elevations in the valley. They do a great job of it. They've added 10 additional wells to the monitoring system, and we appreciate everything that they do in that. We've also worked with the Nature Conservancy to add a stream gauge to the bottom end of Mill Creek, which is an important gauge because, as we can see, most of the water that is not in use is not actually flowing underground to the Colorado River. It's making it back into the streams on the lower end before they hit the Colorado River and flowing out as surface water in the lower end of Pack Creek and Mill Creek. So having a gauge down at the bottom is an important groundwater monitoring tool. So there we go. We've given you the fire hose presentation of our perspective on the USGS report and how it will help inform our decision making going forward on policy and how we should be looking at future changes to appropriation policy within the basin. So I'd open it to questions.
So Mark, thank you for your presentation. Is there any way we can get a link to it?
It will be on our website, yes.
Thank you.
So Mark, Dave Early here again. Has anybody tried to put a number on the development that's in line for Moab right now, the amount of hotels and things, and how that would cut into that 1,000 or 1,300 to 3,500 acre feet that's out there for use, so that we can get an idea where we're at for future appropriations based on what we've already allocated? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. And I was just talking about this with Mike Duncan the other day, and we have not seen a good report about what future development. Well, I know Moab City has a 40-year plan that talks about development of their water rights, and we've seen some population projections for the valley. But that's a great question, and we'd love to have some better information in regards to what the development plans are, especially in the next few years, that are taking place not only within Moab City proper, but within Grand County and San Juan County.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, one thing that.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, may I have the floor?
Yep.
Yeah, Mark, I could add this much. I'm talking about Phil Gardner's latest report now, the pre-journal thing that you and I have talked about, which deals specifically with what Phil called the deep Glen Canyon aquifer and Moab City's springs and wells out there by the golf course. This does not include the Valley Fill aquifer, which was the subject of the report that you just reviewed. But he had some interesting numbers, and one of them was that restricting ourselves again to just the deep Glen Canyon aquifer. That Phil asserts that all this is, of course, subject to review, and I'm sure intense discussion that that the city is already using, withdrawing roughly what's being recharged high in the La Salle, particularly on the north end, and so that factors in. And Dave, to answer your question, as we go, we just had a. You guys may remember that we had a moratorium on new hotels and so forth last year with the intent of reinstating overnight accommodations in this calendar year. And then COVID hit and business interests kind of died. There's a number of hotels and so forth still in the pipeline, so-called vested interests. But other than a hotel or two, not too much is being built right now. And I can tell you that the schedule on reinstating overnight accommodations with different standards for them has been relaxed at the moment. We were under a lot of pressure from the state legislature for private property rights reasons to put them back in soon, and that pressure seems to have gone away for the time being. All of us residents in town like to blame hotels for all our water problems. It's not really quite accurate in the sense that hotels typically don't do a lot of irrigation, the heavy hitter, and where residents do. I mean, I'm on Moab Irrigation Company water, so I don't use much culinary water out of the city's wells, but most people do. And so residential growth is still a critical issue. There is a 40-year plan, but I think that was pretty much predicated on we had lots of water rights, and we weren't worried about withdrawals at the time that report was written. So it'll be interesting to see how all this plays out.
Yes, absolutely. And we do have a copy of the Phil Gardner et al.'s report that they just published in the Journal of Hydrology. And I've actually been talking with them about getting together with them and having a question and answer session with them and really sitting down and trying to understand more of what they're presenting in that paper. You know, one final thing that I would mention, and this is kind of the takeaway that we have been talking about with the various stakeholders in the valley for a couple of years now, is that there may be some additional water that can be tapped on groundwater sources, but really the big users, the big municipal users, Moab City and Groundwater and San Juan County, need to start looking ahead and looking at how to transition away from groundwater and onto some surface sources at some point in time. And that's important. That's important. One of the reasons I felt very that we should do this work and move forward with this work is to help the municipalities see and get an understanding that there are some limits. There are definitely some limits to what we can do with groundwater development in the valley, and that as they look on their planning horizons, there needs to be some thought put into how the big water users in the valley can transition off of groundwater onto some surface water sources. So I think with that, I'm gonna.
Can I ask a question?
Yep, bye, Jeff.
Hey, so my question kind of ties into what you just said, and also I guess with Dave's earlier question a little bit. Obviously, when you were showing these calculations, when it comes to municipal use, you're looking at what they're currently using, not necessarily what they have or in terms of water rights, what municipalities have in terms of their 40-year plans. I'm just wondering how that using the actual use now data fits into the calculation of what's available without looking at those other the other numbers again of what they have or plan to use.
So Jeff, restate that again, your question. I'm not sure I'm.
Well, in the calculations you were just showing, the municipal use number is based on what they're currently using. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Okay. And I guess my question goes towards, well, even though they might be using that right now, they have more water rights that they're holding according to their 40-year plan. And And so I guess I'm a little concerned that we're using current usage numbers to calculate what might be available without looking at what's being held in reserve.
So what's being held in reserve is more than the amount of water available to take out of the system. And that's an important point.
Right.
And that's really where the municipalities need to start looking on their planning horizons for that switch off of groundwater onto subsurface water sources.
Yeah, Jeffrey, if I may add, the city has about 10,000 acre feet a year of water rights. I don't think we're going to get there based on safe yield, as Mark has already stated. So that's a bit of an academic number right now.
And Teresa is our next presenter, and she's, go ahead, Chuck.
Mark,
yeah,
I had a couple questions.
Hey, Arnie, yeah, I was just going to clarify a couple of things. We currently use in the city of Moab about 2,000 acre feet per year, which doesn't reflect our water rights. Our water rights are much higher. And the 40-year plan was done in compliance with state of Utah criteria. And the projections are average yearly demand in the year 2060 is 3,800 acre feet. So about an 1,800 acre feet increase in the next 40 years. And of course, as you know, that partially is based upon zoning and past uses and connections. I just wanted to clarify because there was a little bit of question there, and this report's on our website for anyone who wants to see it. The city's website is the final adopted water distribution storage master plan. Thanks.
That's good comments, Chuck. Thank you. Arnie, did you have some comments?
Wait, I had a comment, then more of another question. My first question before my first statement before I ask the question is that number that you gave out, which was, I don't remember, 450 and 3,500 acre feet we actually have left. 1,300, that does not include what the private well owners are using at all. And we don't know what that is at this point in time?
That's correct.
So we could be over.
Well, so the private well and spring use you'd add to both sides of the equation. If we did know what it was, we would add it both to the recharge side and the discharge side, because just like we did for the municipal use, it's added to both what we believe is on the recharge side and the discharge side. But you do bring up a good point. We're assuming that that we're not over yet. And let me just talk generally. What is more convincing to us than anything is the fact that we are still seeing some water leave the valley to the Colorado River, both as return flows to the lower end of Pack Creek and Mill Creek, and as estimated subsurface flows to the Colorado River. So if we were over, it's unlikely that we'd be seeing any return flow or outflow to the Colorado River system from the valley.
Is Teresa going to talk with where you're going in terms of the availability to allocate water in this basin after you're done with this?
That's a great segue, Arnie.
Yeah, I have one more question before she goes there, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Mark, we've talked before about a groundwater monitoring network in this area, and well aware that some of the wells the USGS uses are not technically monitoring wells, and they're kind of pick and choose by where we could get them as opposed to where we would like them. And they don't always measure exactly what we'd like to measure. We've had that discussion before. And we've talked about putting together a groundwater monitoring network for the valley. At this point in time, you didn't mention it today. Are you still considering putting something like that together? And is UDWRI willing to support that?
We're definitely willing to support it. Putting it together is a challenge, just simply because to do a comprehensive groundwater monitoring network involves a lot of moving parts, and USGS is doing most of that right now as far as well monitoring and stream gauge monitoring. But there's other things that need to be happening. Some additional, we've talked to actually Groundwater about helping us find a way to put a stream gauge on Pat Creek, for instance, at the top end of Pat Creek. And they've shown some interest in that. And so definitely we are interested and support the development of more groundwater monitoring in the area so we can see what's happening. And how we get there is going to be a difficult process because it's going to cost money to implement a lot of that. So.
Yeah, Arnie, I might mention one other thing, and Mark and I have talked about it as well. Chuck, you got the letter as well. Chuck tells me that partially in response to state requirements that he's going to drill another well adjacent to an old well that's no longer in service, so it doesn't require a point of diversion change. Early next year, I believe, Chuck, if I got that right. And so Mark and I both thought this would be a great opportunity to do some drawdown and cross-coupling tests, how much one well draws down others in the areas, and to give us some science data, if you will, on the robustness of the deep Glen Canyon aquifer anyway. And so we're all looking forward to that, and I've already put out a letter, Chuck, kind of giving the mayor heads up to how we'll probably need some money to make that study happen. But I think it'd be a great opportunity to do it kind of cheap because we can take advantage of a well that's going in anyway about the right time.
Yep, and I agree with that, Mike. There's 3 areas that I would love to get some additional research on. That's Ken's Lake contributions to the recharge, the area right around the golf course, which is where your replacement well is being proposed, and down at the Matheson wetlands. So as we move forward, I would love to be able to find ways to get some additional research done in those 3 areas.
So I'm gonna, I know you want to go on. I was just going to say I've actually talked to some of the groundwater people that are some of them are on this call and some of them are not. The biggest cost for groundwater monitoring is going to be the capital right up front. But once we get beyond that, the annual expenses won't be a big pill to swallow. I just think that if we had something on paper, I'm putting a plug in for this because I think it's pretty darn important. That if we had something on paper, an idea of how much it was going to cost us, we could start moving towards that. And I'd like to encourage that. And I honestly believe your agency will have to take the lead.
And Mark, this Dave Willie, I'd say as mayor of Castle Valley, we, before me, put in 6 monitoring wells dedicated with UGS's help and Janae Wallace's help, who's on this phone call. And Arnie, in my opinion, both the city of Moab and Groundwater and Sewer need to bite the bullet, find somebody to give them grants, and figure out where they need their monitoring wells, but they need to put those in on their own nickel because those need to be theirs, not Mark Stilson's. Those need to be, and I mean UDWRI. I mean, the entities need to know what's happening with their well, with their watershed, and be able to defend it. And you can't defend your watershed off of monitoring wells that aren't dedicated. We've talked about this before, but I'll repeat it again. So if there's a takeaway, and this isn't Mark and Teresa's job to get you guys to turn the light on, this is you guys getting to realize that you need dedicated monitoring wells so that you can defend yourselves. There's other monitoring in the valley that needs to be done for sure, but those are the onus of the entities. They have fiduciary responsibilities as the manager of those water rights to know what's going on. So just as I think Mark Stilson has fiduciary responsibility as the regional engineer to know what's going on in the overall system, I don't think that then the entities, the municipalities shirk their responsibilities. And so, because you need those to defend your citizens who ultimately hold your water rights. That's not Mark Stilson's job. That's your job and your fiduciary responsibility. And if there's anything that Castle Valley's been successful at, it's doing that. And I can't reiterate enough that this needs to happen. And the fact that we did it 20 years ago and you guys spent the 20 years developing, I'm sorry, and not thinking about this, well, that's on you. That's not on us. And I just try to tell you this from the outside, but that's the biggest advice I can give to this situation. And I don't want, finally, groundwater basin transfers. As long as you can do that, Castle Valley worries that Moab's going to steal the water for hotels and that the state's going to decide that's better use. We've managed our aquifer well. Let these regions, these aquifers, these communities manage their watersheds and not face trans-basin diversions. That's just, it's suicide for the whole system. So that's my final notes. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, and that's a great segue. I can hand this over to Teresa. She's going to touch on some of those.
So thanks, Mark. And truly, I actually have been listening to everything that's been contributed, and all of you have great segues into kind of the summary that I'm going to give here. But let me do really quickly just a couple house cleaning items, because I think a lot of you have joined us since we started. Remember to click on the comments for this slide presentation, because we need to gather contact information for the folks that are participating so that we can continue to communicate to you. And we will send to your email or your mailing address notices of any future meetings or discussions or information that we have. So please remember to click on that comment and give us your contact information. And secondly, seriously, thank you for bearing with us on an online virtual type meeting. You know, I think all of us struggle just a little bit. I've seen people coming in and out during this, and I'm sorry for any technical difficulties that some folks may have. If you have had something and have missed a portion of the presentation, it is recorded, and we will post that to the website for this meeting as well. So you can go back and maybe listen to a portion of the presentations that you may have missed or want to hear again. So be aware of that, and thank you for just bearing with us through this. So just in conclusion, just have a couple items to talk about. So as we, and I guess on the next slide, I'll have Mark click to the next slide. Is Mark there? There he is. So today, really what we tried to do, and I think the message, hopefully that's being given, and I think Dave kind of hit at this, we can't do it alone. And we have to do this with the communities, and the folks within the community need to start planning and take responsibility as well. And we find that that is really, truly the best way to solve some of these problems, is to keep communicating, collaborate, work together to understand what is happening with the current system and where maybe you need to go and what adjustments you need to make. So the presentations today, Cash talked about the current policies that we have in place. He also gave us a few little basics about some water rights, water right basics. With Mike's presentation, the current adjudication efforts that we have going on, and we're going to continue those. We believe that that is going to give us a picture of what existing rights are in the area, clarify, like I believe it was Mark had brought up, and I forgot the last name, about Pat Creek and some of the questions that he had on Pat Creek, that we can answer those questions with this adjudication effort. And as Mike Drake mentioned, we're looking to publish those 2 proposed determination books in the fall of 2021. And we still are on track with that. COVID has set us a little bit back on some of our processes, but we really are shooting for that fall of 2021, which I think will help us have a lot more answers as to what are the water rights in this area. And Mark gave a great summary of the studies and what we believe may be the groundwater supplies. And I know many of you have been thinking about this. Several of you gave us some comments already of what we need to be aware of and what we need to work through. And I can't reiterate enough how much it's going to take collaboration with the communities and the citizens and the municipalities in the area, and for them to understand what is happening as well. So some of the considerations that we had for the next slide, these next 3 slides just brainstorming with you, you know, as far as some policy considerations. We'd love to hear feedback. You know, should there be additional restrictions on new appropriations in this area? Should we close the valley to new appropriations? Close the valley to change applications seeking to move additional whites into the valley? Develop a groundwater bank. You know, some of these things we hear from you, and some of these things we've thought about. Do we need to look more into them? And so on the next slide, there's a few more that we've come up with. We definitely need to complete the general adjudication, like I mentioned. We believe that we need to promote a discussion and study of the safe yield estimate for the valley aquifers. Promote a discussion and study for the need of a groundwater management plan. Now, we have to exceed safe yield to do that, but that is something that we can talk more about. Improve the groundwater monitoring systems. This last part of this discussion that we just had, several of you touched on that, and that is definitely one thing that we're also looking at and encouraging to have. So additional research in certain areas. Part of this last part of the conversation that you guys had were what some of those may entail, and hopefully thinking about those and continuing that research. On the next slide, we've got a few more items. You know, some of you have brought to us some concerns with climate change. We mentioned today that research paper that Phil Gardner did, and you know, we're aware of it now. We haven't had much time to talk about it, and as Mark said, we're looking to get some, maybe see if they'd be willing to do a question and answer type session or presentation for us. You know, looking at the transition from agricultural use to outdoor watering to municipal use. What does that do? And then also Colorado River issues. We know that that's before us as well. So on the next slide, I think that was the last slide. So you can tell, hopefully you can tell, the reason we scheduled this meeting was to talk with those of you that are interested to spend a couple hours with us on a Wednesday night and talk through these issues, get you thinking about them, let you understand what we're trying to do and the work that we are doing and some of the ideas we have, and we look for some additional comments from you. Like I said, this meeting is going to be recorded, so we'll post that, and we've got your questions. But we also encourage, if any of you would like to provide us with any written comments or additional information, there's a link there that you can send it to. The link for the email, it's a little hard to see in that red, but it says water rights at Utah, or sorry, it's blue, waterrights@utah.gov. And you can email any comments, suggestions, information that you'd like related to this presentation or as we move forward. And then there's also a PO box for our Price office if you'd like to snail mail that. So with that, thank you. Seriously, I can't thank you enough for all of you that took the time to help us talk through this and help us. We're listening, and we want to continue in collaboration with you and make sure that we continue to talk and come up with the solutions that we need to. So with that, we've got the whole group here that presented and some additional staff that were open to some questions if you have any. Anything else?
Teresa, I have a question.
Sure. It was Mark Shapiro that said Pat Creek. That's the last name.
Yes, that's right. That's right. First, thank you very much for holding this meeting. It's been very informative. As we look at the valley at the north end, there are a lot of hypothetical questions about trying to balance development in the future. At the south end of the valley, in the San Juan County portion, there's a real world issue that's playing out right now that's becoming a little bit more than hypothetical. As you know, Sitla owns about 5,000 acres south of Kens Lake, or around and south of Kens Lake. And they sponsored a land use planning study, which was completed about a year ago for that land. And San Juan County is now trying to digest the results, implement zoning policies, and consider future subdivision requests. Sitla is seeking to have the bulk of that 5,000 acres vested for development in one application, even though, as they acknowledge, the build-out period could be looking at 20 to 40 years in the future. So as you look at the situation at the south end of the valley, and as you are in a position to advise San Juan County, can you tell them, to help them inform the decision-making about the vesting process, whether it should be all at once or in a phased process over the next 40 years, can you advise them about the availability of water? And would you even be in a position to say, there is no assurance that we can approve sufficient water rights in the future to handle the level of development that would occupy all of that 5,000 acres?
Okay. So first, I don't know that we could necessarily advise them, but we could educate based on the information that we have. Any applications that they were to submit would have to meet current policy, appropriation policy that's in place. And I don't know if anyone from San Juan County clicked in here to this meeting or not, but we are aware of the Sitla acreage. I'm not aware specifically of what they were looking at doing, and I don't believe we have an application that's been filed at this point. Mark, do we have anything that's been filed?
Sure, let me pipe in on that real quick. There is an approved application. This is the one that kind of kicked all of this off, that San Juan County hoped to do quite a bit of development on groundwater sources. But they also put a point of diversion on the Colorado River. So that application, when it was filed, was for 5,000 acre feet of water. It was approved, but limited to only 500 acre feet of development off of groundwater sources. The Colorado River was approved for full development of the 5,000 acre feet. So the takeaway for San Juan County is, again, the same takeaway as for Moab City and Grand, is that there's limited groundwater supply left to appropriate in the valley. And that future development really needs to look at surface water sources.
And to kind of add to with Mark too, that, you mentioned, water doesn't stop at a county line, right? And so engaging San Juan with Grand County in the discussion would be very helpful.
Hey, Teresa. Hey, this is Mac from San Juan County. I am on.
Oh, hey!
I've been watching the whole time, just listening, taking notes. But no, we definitely recognize the fact with the water constraints. But the difficulty that you have with it is private property owners, whether Sitla is one of those. They do have certain rights that come with the land that they own, especially when you look at transferring water rights, things like that. Sitla, they have lands and water throughout the whole entire state, and so that's kind of interesting perspective. But I think it's just interesting to note, overall water consumption, future smart planning, things like that needs to take place. We're very cognizant of that need. I definitely hear what Mark is stating regarding looking at more of the surface water and the possibility of recapturing those type of things, any parking lot runoff. I think for us, one of the next steps is not only recognition of this, but also a stormwater management plan, being able to capture some of that stormwater runoff that goes to that area about every 10 years off of Pat Creek. Just being able to try to slow the flow, prevent as much as possible leaking back into the Colorado River. And so definitely understandable, definitely a challenge.
And glad that you're engaging in the conversation at San Juan County, Mac. I'm glad that you're part of it, and we'll continue to do that. So,
absolutely, thank you.
And Teresa, this is Dave Early again. Mac did present Sitla as another private property owner, but they have no holding costs. They have never put their land to official use, so they have junior water rights. And I just think we have to look at them as they are, which is a quasi-state entity that when it's convenient, and we in Castle Valley dealt with them for many years successfully, but I would argue that when it's convenient, they're private. When it's convenient, they're public. And as such, they need to step up to the table. So in a little different manner than just any private property owner. So I have argued strongly that the development out there should be tied to the availability of water and them proving that they had water resources. And as Mark mentions, they can go to the Colorado River, but they never talk about that in their development plan and what kind of costs that would put on the acreage up there to bring that water up there. No, the real idea is for all of us in, well, all of those in Spanish Valley, Moab Valley, to subsidize that water project. And that's what makes it really uncomfortable for a lot of us is we're not having that discussion, because that's the real discussion that needs to happen. And is there even the water in the Colorado River for that? And so when we get really chagrined about Sitla, let's remember that's a San Juan River water right that was trans-basin diversioned into our valley against our will. Everyone protested, yet we still have it. And it's now your decision how to distribute it. It seems completely inappropriate to those of us who believe in, rational water management. So I just think that this deserves a lot more issue and a lot more discussion. And you say you want to engage the municipalities. Well, Sitla and San Juan County need to be engaged in this discussion. And the last thing I did as mayor of Castle Valley was get us out of groundwater and sewer, because I knew one day you would be coming and asking us to subsidize that project we would never benefit from either, just like the tax dollars we spent on Ken's Lake. So I have thought about this issue for years, and I feel like the real issue is how we're going to deal with Sitla. And Mark can call it the San Juan Special Service District, but over 90% of their acreage, I believe, is the Sitla lands. So it is as simple as that. So let's all sit down and really talk. And let's talk about what it's going to cost to get Colorado River water up there and what kind of mansions they're going to be building. Let's talk about what the development plan should be. How many acres? Should it be 100-acre lots, 50-acre lots, 10-acre lots? But let's really talk, because what we're talking about right now is a fallacy. What you're talking about is San Juan County is going to permit overnight rentals in San Juan County that are going to totally affect the Moab market and the use of water. I say, great. Let's do all overnight rentals that can be turned off when there's no water there, instead of permanent residences for people who really live in our part of this community. But we got serious issues down here. I'm sorry to rain on the parade, but I truly appreciate everything that's been said. I truly appreciate the honesty of 1,300 acre feet, maybe all we have left. Some of us think that may be a little bit optimistic. But anyway, Sitla matters and San Juan County matters in this mess. And we could get our way out of it probably without them. But if they aren't at the table, they're just going to hold us hostage if they get those development rights. And it's going to be nothing but Chinatown fighting for water in this valley, and Sitla, with Salt Lake's support, is going to cause and drive that problem. No different than what you just dealt with in Kanab, other than the circumstances were different, but it's the same problem. I would argue it's the same problem you're going to have all over southern Utah, because they have developable lands. They've never put to development, so they're junior in water rights. And they're always going to be junior, thus they have to take the political route to get their water rights versus the right route the rest of us have to take to get our water rights. If it wasn't SITLA, we wouldn't have this problem out there in Spanish Valley. No other private developer would be getting the kind of, well, positional authority with San Juan County and others that they are getting. So I'm sorry to say that Castle Valley battled SITLA 25 years ago and won. And again, I think there's lessons to be learned, but that's for others to decide. But I had to say that. I just can't tell you how important that is to this dynamic.
Dave, I want to talk now.
Sorry.
If you don't mind, Teresa, just give me one moment. As far as Dave's comment go, I will let you know that unlike the Bryce Canyon area, you're fortunate you're not being sued by both sides at this point in time because of the SITLA issue. I'll just let that go at that. Teresa, you got down here on your list of things to do is consider closing the aquifer to new allocations. And I guess I don't mean to, I am putting you on the spot. It's not like I don't mean to, I am putting you on the spot. How do you justify keeping the aquifer open for allocation when we know it's over allocated by almost twice as much as water is available?
And mainly when it comes down to, like Mark had mentioned, that we still see some water flowing to the river. And so do we close that? The biggest question that we have to answer, and I think this adjudication is going to help us do that. And so the sooner that we can get that adjudication done, then we'll know exactly what the rights are that are of record. And we're within a year away from that. So we're getting there.
I was kind of under the opinion that you actually needed the adjudication process to be done prior to your being able to actually close the aquifer. Is that true?
The adjudication effort is going to help us know what is fully of record, what water rights do we have. So yeah, and that's what we're talking about next year in fall of 2021, publishing those proposed determinations.
Thank you for taking on such a tough job as the state engineer.
Oh, thanks.
And Teresa, can I add that I would love to get back together as we get closer to the end of the adjudication to talk more about the demand side of things. Have another public meeting, focus in on the demand and what we have found in the adjudication, and get really into the details of what Arnie's asking about, because that's the other side of what the equation, supply and demand. And mainly today we're talking about supply, but we really need to get into the details of the demand, and probably do that with another public meeting sometime next year.
Definitely. Okay.
I have a question, if I may.
Sure. Is it Ann Austin?
Yes, my name's Ann. I live in Spanish Valley, San Juan County. And I was wondering about the implications or consequences of over allocating the water. How would that play out? Meaning, do some people start losing their water? Do we have to ration? Do some people get left high and dry? What happens in that scenario?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And one of the things that we did talk about today is what's called a groundwater management plan. In a lot of areas, the available water may be over allocated and exceeding the safe yield. If that does happen, we do work within the communities to adopt what's called a groundwater management plan. And it does make priority cuts to those water rights that the lowest priority users are cut, so that the senior users do receive their water. And in fact, yesterday, I believe, we mailed out a draft for a groundwater management plan in the Cedar City Valley. So we have a handful of them around the state, but that is one tool that if withdrawals are exceeding safe yield, depletions, are greater than the safe yield, then we can look at adopting a groundwater management plan. So Anne, hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, yeah, more or less. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, any other last questions? Or I seriously appreciate, I can't say enough how much I appreciate all of you participating, the comments, the concerns, even Dave, from Castle Valley, the information that you bring to us, it's all valuable that we need to listen to. So thank you for coming. And like Mark said, we're going to do this again, hopefully in a year. And look forward to seeing you all again and hearing from you.
Thank you.
Okay.
One and all.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, we'll go ahead and conclude the public meeting. Thank you.